obviously an enormous amount of debate over this practice, whether it's essentially the savior of the free internet, given that it does tend to monetize at a higher level, which we'll hear about. At the same time, there's an awful lot of concern among folks that this is really a violation of what the internet really is inherently meant to be, and an intrusive practice that we should, at minimum, have some kind of public policy intervention on. So I won't pretend that we don't have a view on this. We do have a view on it. We generally like behavioral targeting. I think it's a good thing under certain circumstances. But having said that, I will do my best to be a fair and balanced moderator.
Yeah. I didn't know Fox was one of your supporters.
They're not one of our supporters, but they probably should be.
Yeah.
So I'll be fair and balanced. So anyway, before we jump into this, I want to introduce our debaters, and right immediately on my left is Jeff Chester. Jeff is the founder and executive director of CDD, Center for Digital Democracy. He's been an important force in these debates for many years. One of the nation's leading advocates on telecom and privacy issues. In 1996, Newsweek named him one of the Internet's 50 most influential people, and he recently wrote a book, Digital Destiny, New Media and the Future Democracy, in January 2007. Ari Schwartz, immediately to Jeff's left, is the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of CET, which is the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a leading advocacy group here in Washington focusing on issues around IT and privacy and civil liberties. Ari also leads the Anti-Spyware Coalition, and in 2006 won the RSA Award for Excellence in Public Policy Work for that work. He also serves as a member of the U.S. Information Security and Privacy Advisory Board. I'm going to come back to Peter in a minute. Howard Beals, to Peter's left, is the Associate Professor of Strategic Management and Public Policy at George Washington University in the School of Business, where he's been since 1988. He's one of these Renaissance men who moves between academia and government. His research interests include a wide variety of consumer protection and regulatory uses, including privacy. From 2001 to 2004, he was the director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission, and focused on a number of different issues, including privacy, and helped pass the Do Not Call register. And in various iterations before that, he was staff economist at the FTC, assistant director of Bureau of Consumer Protection, associate director for policy evaluation, acting deputy director. And finally, on the far left is Baron Soka. Baron is as a senior fellow and director of the Center for Internet Freedom at the Progress and Freedom Foundation. The PFF is a think tank here in town. Prior to that, he was an associate in the communications practice group at Latham and Watkins, LLP, where he advised clients on the regulations affecting the internet. And prior to that, he was practiced at Lawler, Metzger, Milkman, and Keeney. And while these are our debaters, Peter McGee is going to provide some overview and comment on all this. I didn't ask Peter to take a stand in this debate, since he's sort of the neutral referee, if you will, soaking it all in and thinking about it. But I'm going to call on Peter to provide overview comments for what he hears. Peter is a senior attorney at the FTC's Division of Privacy and Identity Protection. He works on a variety of policy and litigation matters, including online behavioral marketing, and was the primary author of a recent staff report of the FTC's self-regulatory principles for behavioral advertising. He also serves as a member of the FTC's Privacy Steering Committee, and from 1999 to 2004, he was the senior attorney advisor for Commissioner Moselle Thompson, and he's also worked as attorney advisor for Commissioner John Leibowitz. And on Monday, I think you probably saw 4 people. Harvey, were you on that by any chance? 4 of the 5 were on the FTC TV show on Monday. No, Leslie was there, so we have all 5 represented at the FTC hearings on Monday on behavioral advertising. So let me start by asking Baron to kick it off, and the format will be, we're going to ask everybody to make an initial sort of 5-minute comment. We'll go sort of pro, con, and then I'll ask particular questions, and we'll have debate, and then you'll have should have at least 20 minutes at the end for dialogue and questions. So, Baron, you want to start us off?
Thanks, Rob. So I'm Baron Stoker from Progress and Freedom Foundation, and I'm here as a consumer advocate. As a consumer advocate, I recognize that consumers have many values, and privacy is one of them. Privacy is not an absolute.
Baron, do you want to use the mic?
So, as I was saying, consumers having many values, we recognize that life is full of trade-offs and that there is no free lunch. And that online privacy is in tension with free speech, with the great currency that we all have on the internet, which is our attention and the thing that gives advertising value, the thing with which we pay for free content and services. Privacy is, as I said, one value, but it is a subjective thing. It's not the same for all users and for all situations. It's something that varies very directly depending on user preferences. So I'm sure my colleagues will talk a lot about privacy and why they think privacy is in crisis, but I want to tell you why I think advertising is in crisis. First, advertising has many benefits. It communicates useful information to consumers about products, services, ideas, candidates, causes. It is one of the great communicating factors in our lives. And by doing this, it increases the competitiveness of the overall economy. It drives down prices. It makes your dollar that you earn worth more. It raises living standards. But the key benefit of advertising is that many forms of advertising, such as the one we're going to discuss today, support content. They make a virtue out of the necessity for advertisers to spend money to communicate their messages, because that same money turns into revenue for publishers. And as publishers in the broadest sense, publishers of content, which includes journalism, which includes blogs, and it includes publishers of services, whether that's search engines or the apps that you can on a mobile device. All of these things are provided to us by publishers. So, in my view, advertising is in crisis, and so too is the future of media, culture, and online services, because all of our lives are moving towards the internet. We all know this. We all know that the digital world is disrupting every other medium. And so it is critical to me that we find a way to support these media, these services, these publishers in the online environment. So my argument in a nutshell is that we need better targeting and therefore more valuable advertising, because, again, this is indispensable to supporting online content and services. But the second argument is that we can have it in a way that allows users to implement their own subjective privacy preferences. And I think that's what we'll really have to debate. But on advertising, I think Arthur C. Clarke put it best, a novelist and a futurist, when he said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And in our case, that's true of the internet. People really don't understand how it works, but it's also true of the business models. People really don't understand the business model of online advertising. And they don't understand that it is a necessity. It is not something that is simply a nice thing to have. It's something that is literally irreplaceable. And what I mean by that is that if we eliminate a certain value created by online advertising, consumers simply will not step up to the plate to pay for that advertising. Right? They will pay for what advertising would have paid for. They will pay for some content. I'm not saying that micropayments or subscriptions or paywalls can't work at all, but that the delta between those things and what advertising can pay for is significant. And not just in the aggregate, but it's enormous for some publishers. And so when we start talking about restricting the amount of advertising revenue that's available for publishers in the abstract and publishers in specific circumstances, we're essentially talking about industrial planning. How much revenue goes to whom? So I want to be very careful about how we swing the regulatory reckoning. To understand why advertising is a necessity, you have to understand that information is a public good. It's something that cannot be copyrighted because and marginal costs are zero. So radical media abundance means that we're tearing down gatekeepers, we're destroying pricing power, but something has to step in to fill that breach, and that thing is advertising. And I'll talk more about why advertising has become so important, but if I have just a minute, Rob?
Sure.
I just want to give you some context about the fact that advertising is shrinking. It's up 25% down as a share of GDP since 2000. Newspapers show this most clearly. Newspaper revenue, it's not just the classifieds. Classifieds are down 56% from 2000 to 2008. But display advertising revenue, the thing that you see when you go to the advertising newspaper sites, is down almost as much. Right? So this is the crisis that publishers are facing as they try to figure out how to fund their content. So when we talk about behavioral advertising, we're not just talking about things normally called behavioral advertising, the product you all hear about, which is ads that are shown to you based on your likely interests as opposed to simply the keywords on the page, which is contextual advertising. It's about $1 billion of the $7 billion that are spent on display ads. But we're actually talking about something much broader, which is to say about 70, maybe 80% of that display ad revenue depends on some sort of third-party tracking technique. And And it's for things like conversion optimization, frequency capping, and sequencing of ads. These are all things that give advertising value.
Okay, great, thank you. Jeff?
Well,
By the way, before you, if a couple folks in the back, feel free to come and sit up here. There's chairs. Be comfortable. Still working on our mics.
Thanks so much. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Jeff Chester. I want to thank Rob and his colleagues for inviting me. It's a false dichotomy that my colleague has just presented to you. It's not about advertising or against advertising. It's what are the rules going to be? What are the safeguards going to be? Just like we have safeguards, we have safeguards for advertising. In the traditional old media world, what kind of safeguards are we going to have in this powerful force? Now, I've been looking at this market since the early 1990s. And as some of you may know, it was very clear by the middle of 1990s that the one-to-one business model at the heart of online advertising was focused on every consumer, but including children. Children at that time were getting little messages: go and tell us how much money your father makes and send it to us. And my wife and I were able to file a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission, get the Federal Trade Commission to work with us, force the Clinton administration to change its policy, get support from the EU, and we passed the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, the only online law, privacy law there is today. And the industry has grown up very well, not doing the kind of behavioral targeting. There are problems with children. Every website says we follow COPPA, and a whole host of practices that have now emerged to target teens, to target adults, to target Hispanics, to target African Americans, to target you by gender, to target you by how much money you make, to target you on social networks, to target you on mobile phones, to target you on online video, etc., has emerged. This is an incredibly powerful system. It is the most, I know my colleagues have looked at it. We've looked at it since the early 1990s. We passed legislation on it. We've worked with the EU on regulation on it. I'm sure my colleagues here from the online ad industry can tell you about our work on this. And you can read our complaints. We follow this industry very closely. This is an industry that is able to use data, and now it's targeting 2.0 era in a real-time basis that can take all the information that you're doing online, add information from outside data, use very powerful multimedia applications, some of which are even honed by neuroscience. Microsoft, Yahoo, and Google are just three of the companies now testing online ads through neuroscience, running the ads through fMRIs and other kinds of technology to figure out how to make the ads, in their own words, bypass the conscious mind to work directly on the subconscious mind, to influence us. Now, I think to me what's most alarming is that it's about influencing our behaviors that really, without our consciousness, without our consent, and about decisions that we need to make that are the most personal. Our financial decisions. Online advertising played a big role in the subprime crisis. All the people that put all that information out there, hey, enter this contest, became triggers, became information that was sold to subprime mortgage brokers, who then used all the information they got online, and is still going on today, to sell subprime loans, particularly to minorities. The FDA is now finally looking at the role that online advertising is playing in pharmaceutical products. People are being asked to give up all their information on unbranded websites for a host of diseases, and that information is then used to target them to say, why don't you take this brand of drug, or this brand of drug, or maybe you have this kind of problem. African Americans and Hispanics unknowingly are being labeled on their online profile saying, this person is of this race. They have no knowledge of it and no control over it. It is a pervasive, far-reaching system of influence that has grown leaps and bounds. And the Federal Trade Commission, finally, under the new administration, is taking a very serious look at this for the first time. And we're glad, and we're working with them on it. What we need are safeguards. We don't want a very powerful system designed to influence us. And let's think particularly about our most sensitive behaviors. And by the way, teens and adolescents are a big target here. If you go to digitalads.org, you will see an array of examples of how the fast food companies are using the most powerful tools to get kids to eat junk food. We have a national obesity crisis. We don't want to have a system that's invisible, that's unaccountable. We need some rules. And frankly, the online industry would like to have some rules. So it's a balance we have to strike. And that's what we intend to do. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Howard. working on our mic system, and it's not okay. I'll pause, but try to. Why don't you put it a little closer to you, if you would?
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to talk a little bit about this topic. But after listening to Baron and Jeff, I'm going to try to make some connections here where I'm not so sure there were connections and some distinctions in what we're talking about. We can have a discussion about advertising and whether it's good or bad, or whether it's good or bad that fast food people advertise to teens. But they do that everywhere, right? There's nothing about targeting other than knowing that a kid is in the audience, which isn't hard to figure out in any television program or magazine or print media. There's nothing about targeting that has anything to do with that debate. It doesn't increase the value. It doesn't to the advertiser. It doesn't increase the effectiveness of the advertising in that sense. Where targeting matters is uniquely online, because in the conventional media, what typically happens is somebody produces a program, produces content, measures the characteristics of people who like that content in a sample, and then everybody targets based on the average characteristics of that audience, and that works just fine. You know something about the audience that you are buying. Much harder to do that in the online world, and especially much harder to do that in the online world for the so-called long-tail sites, the very small publishers. There's just, you can't do a random survey of users and find out very much about demographics that is in any way reliable in order to tell advertisers what you've got. And a small website or a blogger typically can't support the sales force in order to explain to anybody why this audience is something that advertiser ought to be interested in. That sales force is important. It's clear from the lesson of the big publishers. Big publishers who sell who sell advertising on their sites through their own sales force get display advertising, as I'm talking about, get cost per 1,000 viewers that are on the order of $10 to $20. In order to increase the sellout rate of how much of their inventory they actually sell, they sell some of that through advertising networks. That they get somewhere under $1, right? 70 cents to $1. Okay. Advertising networks, which is mostly who does the targeting, the behavioral targeting that we're interested in. Advertising networks control 80% of the availabilities, right, of the actual exposures. They get 30% of the revenue. There's a huge price disparity, and targeting is a way to try to narrow that disparity. Okay, because as I said, with conventional media, you produce a program, you measure the characteristics of the audience and target based on that. What happens with online targeting is rather than measure an audience that comes together for some other reason, you try to assemble an audience that has a certain set of characteristics. And people with this characteristic will see this ad in a variety of different places. But it's putting together the same kind of audience. You really don't care who the people are. What you care about is the characteristics of those people and how you put them together. Now, it's clear there's a lift in the price from being able to target advertising as opposed to untargeted advertising. It's not clear how much at this point. At the FTC workshop, there were people who said that the order of magnitude was that the price per view was 5 to 10 times higher for targeted advertising than for non-targeted advertising. And what's crucial about that, and this is to bring this back to Baron's point, is the kind of content that it will support. If you think about newspapers, for example, right? Newspapers in the real world get an average of about, in the physical world, get an average of about $5.50 per 1,000 views. Okay? In the online world, a lot of them, if they're selling through networks, are getting under $1, right? You get very different content if your audience is worth $1 per 1,000 than if it's worth 5 times that. And that's where the online advertising is so important, right? I agree with Jeff. There ought to be appropriate safeguards. It ought to be possible for people who are really concerned about this to avoid it. But it's those safeguards have to strike a balance, okay? Or the problem will disappear because there won't be anything interesting on the internet to go see.
Great, thank you, Howard. We'll, as we get towards the end, we'll get specifically into policy implications, what we all ought to do. Ari.
Thank you again for having me, Rob. I really appreciate it. And I wanted to push back a little bit on some of the things that Howard discussed. And although I agree with almost everything that he said, I think that I hear a little bit of an idea that this 5 to 10 times amount comes from some kind of efficiency of markets out there that I don't necessarily agree with from what I've seen in my study of the advertising market today, which is that we have these interest-based ads, and I'm not talking about all kinds of behavioral targeting, I'm not talking about all kinds of use of personal information for advertising purposes, but I think when we've discussed this issue of behavioral advertising, a lot of the focus has been on the issue of interest-based ads, meaning targeting individuals based on categories categories of areas of presumed interest based on sites they've been to in the past. So putting them in different kinds of buckets based on past behavior, not based on what site they're currently on or very recent behavior, by kind of trying to draw inferences about individuals. And what I've seen in that space is actually you don't hear publishers as the ones who come to its defense. Why do we think that is? Why isn't the Online Publishers Association up there arguing in favor of this business model? If this is the savior of publishing, which is what we've heard, it's not the discussion on the table was the savior of the internet. Internet advertising doesn't need saving. It's doing fine as it is. Publishers are the ones that have been in trouble, and that's where the advertising revenue that you heard from Barron has gone down. Publishers aren't the ones speaking up in favor of this model because publishers are not seeing the gains from charging more from this space. The ones who are seeing the gains are the ad networks and the advertising agencies, right? And it just so happens, and if you talk to the advertisers who advertise in this space, they'll tell you that they don't know whether they're buying interest-based ads or not. They leave it up to their ad agencies to make these decisions for them about where ads are purchased, which has inflated the price of the ads in this space. And I think if you look at those where you have a more efficient market, like Google AdWords, right? If you look at the information that we have from there, as we saw in the TechCrunch article on October 30th, only 25% of advertisers in that space have taken them up on interest-based ads. And that's only the ones that are even thinking about doing it, not the ones that actually do it. So I think there's a question about how efficient this is compared to other forms of advertising. Again, we're very supportive of the idea of online advertising and the advertising-based model. Can we come up with something that actually works in this space? The idea of interest-based ads just is not necessarily going to be the savior that people once made it out to be for publishing. And I think that at some point, people that are pushing so hard on this as though that's the only argument on the other side of the privacy piece have to at least admit that interest-based advertising might not be worth fighting that hard for if you're trying to save, if your goal is to save publishers. Now, the use of personal information, on the other hand, I think is an area of discussion, right? And that's why we have this discussion about interest-based ads and why CDT cared so much about this in the early days where we didn't raise as many issues of contextual ads, even in areas where some other people did, like in Gmail and other spaces. We have less concerns about the contextual ads than we do about the storing of information over time to build for the purpose of building a profile about individuals. We think that you could probably put some controls on that type of collection of information, but we have to figure out what those are in advance, and they have to be based on building in technology that works for consumers, so you're putting consumers in control of the information, self-regulatory models in this space, enforcement of existing law, and new legislative efforts. And we've seen areas, and I think it's also important to point out, we've seen areas where the use of information in the internet space for advertising has caused direct harm for consumers in the past. We've seen the adware space, right, where we know that these models trying to suck out as much information about individuals as they can by installing software onto people's computers to get to send advertising to them cause direct harm to consumers. We've now had a lot of more information about the push-transaction marketing space, right, where trying to get people to sign on to trials, past trials that they don't really want by gathering their credit card information from other places and deceptively tying information to them that they don't necessarily understand is there. We've seen models that do harm consumers directly. We think there's a potential for harming consumers in areas like interest-based advertising if it's not done correctly. And therefore, it's important to try and get those series of protections in place for these kind of models to make them work in the marketplace in order to build the trust that's necessary to make them successful. And that's the reason it's important to work in all those areas at the same time, rather than ruling some out from the beginning, as some people seem to do.
Great, thank you. I want to let Howard or Baron respond to that, but I also want to sort of add another component, which is really, I think, Ari crystallized the debate in a lot of ways. Is a debate between what are the benefits on this one side, and you can sort of, if you will, the benefits to society or the benefits to the publishers, the people who look at that. And then there are the potential impacts on consumers, and some people actually argue these are benefits.
And on publishers. There are negative consequences for publishers too, which is not which needs to be part of the debate when we're actually talking about news.
So one side, if you will, sort of benefits and costs to society, to publishers. Another one is about consumers. I wanted to talk about the benefits and costs to publishers for a minute. And maybe you guys could respond to Ari's point about this, because it seems to me part of the debate is if these ads, if behavioral advertising got you a bump up of 5% better revenue return, you know, sort of like, well, that's not really a big deal. We should just have, and maybe there's some concerns about privacy. On the other hand, if it does what Howard says it does from what the person said at the FTC, that it's 500%, a much more efficient model, a much bigger set of revenues for small publishers, all of that, then that's a bigger deal. So I want to let Baron or Howard first respond to that, and then we'll come back to.
Then I want to respond to that point.
Let them do it first. Yeah, of course, no, that's what I was going to say, Jeff. Then I'm going to come back to you.
I think Ari makes a good point. The question is how much of this money actually goes through to publishers. Let's assume that the rate differential, I didn't hear Ari disagreeing, is 5 to 10 times. The question is what goes to publishers.
Well, I've heard from some ad networks that it's closer to the 5% mark than the 500% mark. So I don't know what the exact numbers are.
Okay, we don't know.
The industry is claiming that it's consistently 8 to 9%, 8 to 9 times.
Let Howard do it, and then I'll come back.
I mean, certainly what we need here is some better data, okay, to figure out exactly what the magnitude is, and that would be a very useful thing to do. From what I understand from people in the industry, it's bigger than what you understand from people in the industry. We need to do something more systematic to try to figure out what the truth is. The way this market typically works, the typical network model is the network buys the advertising availabilities from the publisher, and then the network resells that ad to others. If you've got an audience that is a valuable audience in any respect, the network will bid more for that audience than the advertising availabilities than others. Now, and this goes to some extent to Baron's point too, what's not clear at this point is what's really the scarce resource on the internet. If the scarce resource is attention, then it's not so clear that all of those advertising availabilities are going to be worth that much to publishers, and that's going to create an issue about how do we finance internet content, to which I don't know the answer. Means people need to look for a new business model if that turns out to be the case. The example I wanted to just mention to make that concept clear of what's scarce here is television. The early days of broadcast television networks paid stations to carry their programs because the advertising was valuable enough to sell it to advertisers that they wanted to pay for the audience. Today, the distribution is easy, the programming is scarce, and stations pay networks for the right to carry their programs. Right, but what's scarce is really crucial in figuring out where the money's actually going to go, because whoever controls what's scarce is going to get where the revenue is going to end up.
May I jump in here?
Yeah, and then
So Howard is exactly right to talk about this in terms of scarcity, but there is a second scarcity, which is interest, right? Search engines make 45% of online ad revenue, so just over $10 billion. You can want to put that in perspective. You can compare that with $7 billion in total, online plus offline, ad revenue for big three newspapers in this country: USA Today, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the Nationals. Okay, it is a big number, and the reason that search engines make so much money is that search terms are the perfect expression of interest, right? So this is the great value, is knowing what somebody is actually interested in. Because those are the only two things you have. You have the opportunity to show them an ad, and you have the opportunity to show them an ad that they might actually find interesting, that is valuable to an advertiser, and that therefore is valuable to a publisher. So what you need to understand about this space is that the internet is commodifying many things, and in this case, it is commodifying our attention. Right? Everywhere we go, there's an opportunity to show us an ad, which is part of the problem. It is to say that there is no longer a scarcity of opportunities to show us ads as there once was. It once was that the newspapers were perhaps something like the gatekeepers that Jeff likes to decry. But in this case, there are opportunities everywhere. And so if we commodify our attention, right, if the attention goes everywhere to a million different places, what matters in terms of funding is how much is the ad worth, how much is every impression worth, and that in turn depends on how well ads can be targeted to our interests. And if you prohibit publishers from selling ads or restrict them in ways that prevent them from selling ads that are targeted to our interests, they will make pennies. They will have digital pennies that will trade in for the dollars that they've been making in the analog world. And all of these models that depend on advertising will have no other option. Right?
You haven't answered the question as to why publishers don't seem to be fighting for this model.
Well, because publishers, first of all, publishers are not a monolith, right? So publishers groups you mentioned, for example, are in many ways strained because they represent both very, very large publishers and to some extent the longer tail. The groups that are fighting hardest for this model are the groups that represent very small site operators, very small publishers like the Interactive Advertising Bureau, right? And they are pushing for the value of advertising. In fact, the study that I mentioned earlier that tried to assess the extent of display revenue that depends not just on behavioral interest, but on some sort of tracking, is 70 to 80%.
Let me respond because one of the things we've been trying to do with the FTC in the last couple of years, and it's only now taken effect really in a kind of at the highest level because of the change of management, is that you cannot separate out the data collection process and understand how to better protect privacy unless you understand the online advertising ecosystem, as they call it. They're talking about an old model, and it's not the way it works. It's based on engagement, and I suggest you can go to Microsoft Advertising. Has fabulous material, by the way, to explain it, and so does Google and others, and we can make it available. It's not about selling you an individual ad. The business model is to have a relationship and connection with you everywhere online. When I talk about online, social networks, mobile phones, online video, search engines, the array of services. It's to have a relationship with you. Some of it's for branding, some of it's for direct response, but the targeting is a part of it, but it's an array of strategies, and therefore to understand the business model, you have to understand the engagement ethos, and now advertisers like Procter & Gamble and Kellogg are paying the advertising agencies per engagement. When you get somebody to sign up a form, click this and all that, that's when they get paid. So it's a whole new business model that has emerged, and you have to understand the business model. Now, there's a downside to publishing here too. So the content publishers, particularly news and public affairs, which are very important, we have to figure out, what we can do for them. They have troubles because they're a small part of this very, very huge system. And of course, in this new world where advertising and editorial content and direct response, the barriers are obliterated, advertisers are becoming publishers themselves. They're creating content, they're funding content, which raises other consumer protection issues. So you have to look at the bigger model. We've written about this. You can read our papers at digitalads.org, papers that Catherine Montgomery and I and other academics have written that explain how this really works, and that's where the debate needs to be, and that's where the FTC is finally looking at. I also just want to throw out there a downside to news and public affairs, because as many of you know, I've been working to protect news and public affairs for many, many years of media ownership, etc. Online advertising is playing an increasing role in shaping the news hall, in shaping the priorities of what the news media puts on online. So there is a real danger here that we have to sort of look very carefully at, about the role that advertisers are playing in shaping the future of editorial content, and to make sure that we devise a system for news and public affairs that sets online advertising right in some way to ensure that what we're seeing is real news and not frankly just infomercials.
Okay. I want to let Peter make a comment, but before I do that, I want to ask each side if you would raise your hand if you agree with this statement. Do you think if there's a difference of the 5% to 500%, and a lot of that is going to the publisher at the 500% level, does it make a difference to you in your position on the advocacy of behavioral targeting if it's different? In other words, if you think it's...
publishers are getting more money
No,
with
hold
behavioral targeting.
on. No, I'm just stating a pure hypothetical. If it's true that publishers are getting a lot more money from behavioral targeting, will you guys... Let me just finish so that everybody's clear on the question I'm asking.
Yeah.
If there's really very little difference, if it's 5%, would Howard and Barron sort of say, well, maybe then we should be more concerned about this and maybe more supportive of regulation? On the other hand, if it's the 500% thing, would you guys be saying, wait a minute, that's changing a little bit?
I think that's the key question.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's what question I'm asking.
It's not a yes. I don't have a yes or no answer, because I feel as though if the publishers were making more money off this, they knew that they were making more money, but they felt that they had a stake in it, we could have a discussion about how publishers can involve consumers, because the publishers are the ones with a direct relationship with the consumer. Because we don't have that, right, publishers feel as though they're being left out. They don't want to engage in this discussion at all, right? Then you have these people that don't deal with the consumer, so of course they don't care what the consumer really thinks.
All right, I'm dealing with a hypothetical
But I want to
question.
answer because
It's not the publisher.
Given that
it's the business model. The fact of the matter is the business model. So even if the publishers make more money, the business model now is instantaneously doing real-time profiling, incorporation of offline databases, updating your profile on a second-by-second basis wherever you go. Now, that business model needs to be regulated to make sure that it's under the control of the individual and not the publisher or the ad.
I'm going to actually do it even more aggressively, and if I don't get an answer, we'll move on. Barron, if there's a difference, if there's no difference, does that change your view of this issue in the policy? Does that difference issue make a difference to you?
Yeah, it does. And the difference is big. And the simple reason, as I mentioned before, is advertising has supported media, free media in this country for centuries, right? It has been an alternative to government funding. It has allowed us to operate independently from political pressure. And now advertising is collapsing. And groups like Free Press have come forward and said, oh, we'll just have the government fund it. We'll have taxpayer money, or we'll just tax advertising. And we'll use that to support media, because they realize that the advertising model is collapsing. And the problem is, they're the ones breaking the business models. So in the case of music, it's very easy for them to say, oh, you know what, the music industry needs to change. Your broken business model is not my problem. Here, they're wrecking the business model. And they're wrecking it because it's a business model that is developing, right? This is the critical detail here, is that this is something that is emerging in response to the change wrought by technology. It is becoming more and more necessary to serve better targeted.
All right, I'm going to take that as a yes, and that's like really short answer. Howard, yes or no? Does it make a difference?
Yeah, it matters. The privacy consequences are the same regardless of the price differential, and the programming benefits are substantially different depending on the price differential.
All right.
I would say it matters in how you go about making the decisions about how to do the balancing test of and how to engage.
Does
consumers.
the balancing test matter, I guess, in your
I mean, the
view?
privacy concerns are the same,
Right.
and we care about it in either case.
But does the
right?
benefit matter to you in terms of in your calculus of how you at CDT think about this, or Jeff at Senator
Again, well, that's why I
does the
said that
benefit
point
matter
about
on the debate?
it does matter whether the publishers are getting
Hypothetically, the publishers
are getting a
does that
chunk
matter?
of it. That makes a big difference.
Jeff, does that matter to you?
Not to me.
Thank you.
Let's hear from Peter.
You have a really short answer, and I appreciate it. Peter, I'm not going to ask you does it matter to you. I'm going to ask you sort of so far, what is your sort of
Have we
view
given
and
you a
take?
headache yet, Peter?
I still have a headache from Monday. I think it seems to me that we're really operating in the dark here until we can get a better sense of what Baron calls the delta between the value of a targeted ad versus the value of a contextual ad. If it really isn't that big a difference, then I think why not go with contextual ads that appear to cause less concern to consumers if you look at things like the Turow study. A couple other thoughts though. I think there is a real concern about the long tail and allowing a lot of voices to be online, and I don't think anyone wants that to end. But I think there are also concerns about things like the chilling effect of surveillance, that a consumer may not research certain things because he or she doesn't want information about that activity collected. And I'm also concerned about things like this concept of boxing that we heard a bit about on Monday, the idea that you're sort of constraining or cabining in what somebody gets to see and know about because you're taking away their ability to make choices. I think this is a very difficult issue, and I'm not sure what the answers are on this, but to go back to the initial point, I think some additional research, at least on the value of the two different types of advertising models, is a great place to start. And perhaps people have ideas about who should be doing that research, funding it, and
Great, thank you. Hiram, I want to move into three issues I want to cover. One was this. The second one is this issue of one was the benefit. The second one is the harm or the benefit to consumers. One is the benefit to publishers and the society, and the third is policy. Let me move on to the second point, which Peter alluded to, the notion of boxing. And maybe Jeff, if you want, I'll let you start on this. We hear a lot about this issue of some argue that this is a real threat to consumers. It violates their privacy, it boxes them, and other harms that Jeff alluded to, some things with children. We hear the other side that this is really a benefit to consumers. They get better information. That information can oftentimes help them with different decisions. Let's just talk a little bit about that harm versus benefit dynamic and how you see that.
Well, and I hope that you will read, we just filed comments as part of the proceeding that the FTC is doing, that the workshops are part of. We just filed comments with our partner, U.S. Curve, that really is perhaps one of the best sort of up-to-date. If you really want to know the state of the art, real-time targeting, we call it cookie wars, which is what the industry is calling it now, selling our profiles. That's there, and you can get that at the FTC or at democraticmedia.org. But we have covered this. Look, there is a real danger here, which is why we need the FTC, and we're glad the EU is also looking at this in a kind of serious way, to understand what the emerging nature of the online media system will be. And as we all know, online will be pervasive. It will be television, right? So it's everything. Advertisers and marketers have the ability and are engaged in doing lots of research to understand individual preferences, through conversion techniques and what they call A/B landing pages and other kinds of devices. They are honing in based on our reactions and the data to our specific interests and vulnerabilities. And the content that we receive that surrounds the advertising, which I do think advertising is the single most powerful force shaping the future of the media system, which is why we have to be, and it's not in a crisis, by the way, it's healthier and it's growing, and we really shouldn't be worried about it at all. The content and the advertising is going to reflect our unique interests and vulnerabilities and be able to be changed in real time, in a mill setting. That's the system that they've now developed, and that's now being rolled out. So So what you see and what your neighbor sees may be totally different. Now, who makes that decision? This goes to me, to the heart of the debate, especially in a democratic society. Why should you get an ad and an article supporting a subprime loan when your neighbor, who happens to be white, because right, we know the overwhelming sales of subprime loans, regardless of income, went to African Americans and Hispanics. Why should that happen? Who's behind the box? So this is the system of personalization that is emerging. There are real dangers here. That's the boxed-in kind of effect. It's happening, and we need to examine it and create the most appropriate safeguards for it. Thanks.
Thank you. Howard or Baron, you want to?
If I can respond here, I need to just jump way back when Jeff referred to me and Howard as representatives of industry. I really resent that because, you know, I work for a nonprofit think tank. I believe in this, Jeff, just as strongly as you do.
Can you tell the people your funders, please? Will you tell them some of your funders,
You
please?
see them all at pff.org. They're all disclosed.
Online advertising.
Yeah, well, you know, not very many of them, frankly. And one of the problems here is that the online advertising industry is, unlike other industries, is not well prepared. It's not used to dealing with regulation, right? One of the reasons that, to answer Ari's question, that they're not out in front on this issue is they are disorganized because it is a decentralized industry, right?
That wasn't my question.
Hold on a second. But Jeff, please. My central point here, Jeff, is I'm not in the business of attacking your motives. You're trying to dismiss me and Howard as industry shows. You do it all the time, right? And on the point about advertising being in crisis, I can only assume that you actually haven't looked at the statistics because the numbers are really clear. As I mentioned before, advertising is down 25% as a share of GDP since 2000. It has now been its lowest level since the dark days of the 1970s.
I want you to create 1 minute on responding to the specific point, though, of harm.
Right. So let's talk about harm. So let's be clear here that there are two different conversations going on. Ari, to his credit, has been mostly focused on privacy, and that's an important conversation. It's one we should have. Jeff has a wholly different concern, which is this belief that advertising is inherently manipulative and evil, that it corrupts us because people are fundamentally stupid and easily tricked, right? So for Jeff, and he answered this question earlier when he said that he wouldn't really care if better advertising produced 500% better revenue, because he thinks that advertising is manipulative. And I don't. Now, on the privacy concerns, the reality is that there is another option here. We don't need to go right to regulation, right? Our alternative, which is a principled alternative, is to empower and educate. If consumers are concerned, for example, Peter mentioned chilling effects, maybe the FTC should start the sort of campaigns that it does extremely well to educate consumers about the tools that are already available to them, such as the private browsing mode in your browser. So if there's something that you're specifically concerned about, you have that option. But if you ask people if they're concerned about their privacy online in a generic way, as the Turow study did, what they will tell you doesn't reflect their real-world choices. It reflects the thing about which they are the most sensitive. So if we give people the control, we educate them about those tools, they have the option to conceal that activity. And that's a good thing, and that should address our privacy concerns.
Ari?
I agree with the context on as one piece, with what Baron said as one piece of the solution, which is we have to move from this kind of 1980s direct mail kind of model where everything's done in a black box and then sent to consumers and they respond or don't respond, and that raises more revenue, and that alone is worth collecting reams and reams of information about every individual that can be used for lots and lots of different purposes. And I think that's where the harm starts to come in, is we've seen that model create harms and drive for a collection of more and more information, and we're concerned about seeing that online as well. And as I said before, we've also seen some models in this very space that have caused some direct harm to consumers as well, such as adware and post-transaction marketing. So I don't think it's too far out of the realm to say, as you're building these profiles about individuals, that there could be potential harms, both the dignity sense that, as it's been talked about at the FTC in the FTC discussions, and in the actual financial harms as well, with a range and a spectrum in between, all of it being important for privacy matters. On the other, what we need to move to is a model where that's more like that engages individuals, the Web 2.0 model of what advertising is. Can we get to the point where individuals understand that advertising is part of the marketplace, that they're making decisions in this marketplace, that what they do it allows them some controls, and gives it the ability to take control. We started seeing moves in that direction from Google, from Yahoo, and others. Those are great steps in the right direction. However, there are going to be those that don't follow along. And the question is, what do we do about those? And what do we do about new models where we might be able to put something in the right direction, right? Where something, you might be able to build an advertising model that might go the right way. However, some bad actor comes in and destroys that whole marketplace by doing the wrong thing early on and destroying trust in that system. So I think it's important to say that you can't just say we need this technology alone can solve this. We also need to have government play a role as well where appropriate.
A couple things, by the way. We will adjourn precisely at 11:30, and we will have time for questions, but I want to make sure you focus on this question on the table, which is harm versus benefit.
That's exactly what I wanted to do.
Wonderful.
Someone once defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting a different result. And, you know, in a sense, that's sort of the boxing concern. If you do the same thing over and over again, you're likely to see pretty much the same advertising and the same content and the same sort of material about you. But in a world where you can Google anything, it's really hard to think that that box is made out of anything substantial. And in a world where people are paying attention real time to what you're doing, if you do something different, it's going to change. I mean, that's the point of paying attention to your interests in real time. Is it's going to change. You're not a box. The places where at least where Marty Abrams talks about boxing, where there's something that's going on, are things like credit reports, where the statistical predictive power is really quite substantial of who's likely to repay their debts and who's not, and decisions get made based on that. That's right, but it's not boxing, that's risk management. What happened in the subprime crisis was we forgot risk management. Second, I think some of the things that Ari in particular is talking about aren't really problems of online targeting. And in particular, this what Ari calls post-transaction marketing. We used to call it the FTC upselling. It happens on nearly every telemarketing call. That somebody tries to sell you something else because they hand off the call after the transaction that you engaged in initially to somebody else and try to sell you something more. Now, there's nothing wrong with that at all if they're really getting consent and it's something that you really wanted to buy. In the context of the telephone call, we built in the telemarketing sales rule a set of protections to make sure there really was consent. If those protections aren't working online, well, that's the place to focus. I mean, the problem isn't targeting, the problem isn't the handoff. The problem is people using the information that came in that handoff and making unauthorized charges on your credit card. And I don't much care how you got my credit card number, whether I gave it to you directly or indirectly. I don't want you to make unauthorized charges on it. It's not a privacy problem, it's an unauthorized charges problem.
Let me sort of go to the third issue, because we're not going to have a lot of time on it. So I just want to throw it out there for folks to, in thinking about the policy question, and there are a myriad of policy questions to think about with regard to this, or different levels of what to do and how to do it. I want to focus on one, though, which is if we have to think about a regime, three possible regimes: opt-in, opt-out, and sort of nothing, or leaving it as it is, as in terms of a rule that the federal government would initiate. In other words, you can't get behavioral targeting to you unless you affirmatively opt in, or you can opt out of it, or there's nothing. What are people's views on where we ought to be on that? Happy to start with you, Jeff.
Well, we are working with a coalition of organizations: Electronic Frontier Foundation, Consumers Union, Consumer Federation of America, PIRG, many of the other leading consumer privacy organizations. We supplied Congress and the FTC with a set of principles, which is on our website and other places. And we believe opt-in should be the model. People need to have affirmative consent, and there should be, in fact, no data collection at all for sensitive information, financial and health information. That's what we told Congress. That's what we believe.
Thank you. Barrett?
We talked a lot about deltas earlier, so the other delta you need to keep in mind here is the delta between opt-in and opt-out, and it is huge. So let's make no mistake about this. You may have, in an opt-out world, you may have a few % of people opt out. In an opt-in world, you may have a few % of people opt in. and this is partly because of the transactions costs involved, the time and effort, and partly because people just don't care, but also because of one far more important thing, which is that when we're talking about online advertising and free content, which that word hasn't been used enough here today, we're talking about users being able to free ride, right? So the problem with opt-in is that you go to a model where it's very easy for the individual user to decide, you know what, I'm going to block that ad, block tracking. Firefox, 60 million downloads of AdBlock Plus. People are able to make these decisions for themselves. They're not as stupid as some people seem to assume. They're able to use tools. And if we need to educate them more, let's do that. So in answer to your question about government models, the model that I'd like to see is a layered approach where we deal with the real harm, which is government access to data. Right? We didn't even talk about that today. Let's erect a higher wall of separation between web and state so that the real things I'm concerned about don't happen, right? And if you want to talk about empowering and educating users, I agree with Ari, let's do that through technology. We don't need to do it in a way that it's a one-size-fits-all solution. When Ari is a big supporter of P3P, and it's one of the areas where he and I can lock arms and sing hallelujahs. But a lot of the problem is that people on P3P, it's a disclosure format. It basically says, what are your practices in a granular way? What do you do with data? A lot of the problem is people look at it and they think it's too hard. But that's a mistake, because P3P isn't a user interface. It's a tool, just like the Obama administration disclosing government data. Right? When you make the data available, anyone can build tools around it that empower users to make their own decisions or to subscribe to somebody else's preferences. It can be easy. We can do it in a way that makes the FTC better able to fulfill its enforcement role.
Okay, thank you. All right.
I disagree that the delta between opt-in and opt-out is very large, and here's why. Because I think that if you have an opt-in regime, there's always going to be the option to say you can either opt in and have this be a free service, or you can, or you don't have to opt in, and then you have to pay some amount of money, and it will drive people to opt in anyways, and you'll have a lot of people that don't really want to share their information that are opting in, and it doesn't really show necessarily the value, the direct value, depending on how much they're able to charge for it when you're talking about making pennies on each individual user for each individual ad network. So. Or for each individual publisher. So I think that the opt-out, on the other hand, I think does, you can create a very easy to use opt-out. Howard showed that with the do not call list. I think there are a lot of other ways to make that kind of very easy to use opt-out. You can build things into the browser. I'll say that directed to the browser people in the room. And I think that there are very simple ways to build opt-outs that will be user-friendly, that users can take control of. We've seen it work in the technology space, and that is the better option in terms of moving policy forward between the two, if you're forcing me to choose between the two.
Right, thanks. Howard, and then we'll go to Peter.
I think opt-out is the more sensible way to go here. I think that for two reasons. One is I think there are a lot of people for whom this is a question not worth thinking about. They're not willing to click on a privacy link. They're not willing to engage in any effort to think about this question, because they just don't think that what's at stake is worth it. And if what's at stake is what ad you get, I frankly agree. It's not worth. I have other things to do with my time than think about whether I want to control information where that's what it's going to affect. What you get, though, with opt-out is for people who do care, there's a way out. It ought to be a reasonably easy way out, as Ari says. It ought to be a reasonably easy way out. What you find in experiments, there's a very interesting experiment that was done, is for the people who don't care, the default matters. Whether it's opt-in or opt-out has a big effect on what the result is. For the people who do care, the choices are more consistent. They make the same choice whether the rule is opt-in or opt-out. And what that says to me is the people who care ought to be able to protect themselves. That's the point of one of these policies. And opt-out does that. And it does it in pretty much the same way as opt-in. Second reason, and it's sort of related to that consistency of preferences I give, is there are a set of costs of protecting yourself or of the government protecting you. With opt-out, the people who pay those costs of self-protection are the people who care. And that makes sense. If you care about kosher products, you ought to bear the cost of finding kosher products. If you don't care, you don't care. With opt-in, the people who don't care are the ones who bear the costs. There's no reason for that. Whatever costs there are end up being imposed on the people to whom it doesn't matter because of the loss of revenue, however big it is, whether it's 5% or 500%. Those costs are borne by the wrong people. You want to structure a rule in a way that people's behavior tells you whether they care or not. And opt-out does that, opt-in does.
Okay, thank you. So before we go out to the audience, Peter, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I mean, having to vote which way or the other.
For it all.
Maybe I just ask you to just tell us what Commissioner Leibowitz will vote. And you've heard now this debate. Or what's your thought on it? How are you struggling with these questions at the commission? What's your thought on all this?
My thought is that what's really key here is for industry and maybe others, maybe the FTC through consumer education, but someone needs to explain to the consumers what the value proposition is here and to articulate the fact that you are getting free content online and what you're giving up for that. And they have to give consumers a meaningful choice to say, that's fine, I want to get free content and I am not concerned about somebody collecting information about me, or I don't like that. And there have to be actual tools that allow them to do that in an easy way. But I also think that we should be talking about some other ideas, like specifying the use of the information that's being collected, and perhaps minimizing the retention of that data, so that if you are concerned about a third party getting it, it's already gone and they can't get it. I know the consumer groups in their legislative primer suggested something like a 24-hour retention period. I don't know what the magic number is, but something like that I think could take a lot of the concern away. But also explaining to consumers what's going on here, I think is the best approach. I think when it's mysterious and consumers only half understand what's happening, that's where you get a lot of concern, and I think that's in a lot of ways why we're here now.
Great, thank you. I had 17 questions I was going to ask. I've gotten to 3, which is great, and you were all concise, which tells me that this is a very important debate, but also very detailed and complicated debate. So, for example, we could have gotten into a whole question on data retention and the pros and the cons and what you do, and a whole set of other issues. So, leaving that aside, I do think I found this very useful and very informative. Comments, questions, if you can identify yourself and direct a comment at someone if you want, or just to the whole. Yes, sir.
I'm Mark Eichhorn at the FTC. I scribbled a few things on my cut here.
We do have paper at here, too.
I guess a quick thing on the upselling, Howard. I think the cases that Ari was talking about are cases that we've done where basically fraudsters have somehow obtained people's credit cards from sources that are not exactly clear, where the consumer didn't have any transaction with that party beforehand, or were not transferred to that party from somewhere else either. So it's a little bit of a mystery, but somewhere where they're obtaining these lists of credit cards. But just a couple other quick points on some of this, and Ari, that's your point of why publishers are not objecting. I think some of it's a cannibalism thing, because I think that you might have the post who is better off with sort of targeting, and I mean without targeting, in a sense, in that the long tail, some blog might attract my business and get more money from putting an ad up at the expense of the post where I might otherwise go. I think that kind of thing.
I haven't heard that from publishers, that particular concern, but I see where you're coming from, and I actually want to make. I wanted to follow up on the upselling thing too, but time passed. I let it go. My point in raising it was more of that we've seen that we're not sure exactly what Mark's trying to say, which is we're not quite sure how this process works, but we know that if we put rules about how information flows are transferred in place, that we may have been able to avoid and may have been able to lessen the market for that kind of information up front. And that's
if
really
I can just follow up on that. I mean, there are so many sources of stolen credit card numbers. I mean, that is, this is not hard information to get. The problem isn't the information sharing. This is a fraud problem. And information sharing rules are not going to be followed by the people we're worried
But I'm
about.
saying it was legitimate sites that actually, I mean,
Well,
you
but
can go
that's
look at the
just
list.
something.
You can go look at the list. You can go look at the list on Rockefeller's that Rockefeller put together. They're legitimate sites that engage in practices, and it's like you said. I mean, they could have looked back and said, well, there are ways to go about doing this, or there are not ways. They decided that these sites decided that they were going to push the limits mostly because their competitors were doing it, and it was a way to make some money right now. If we're in trouble afterwards, we'll deal with that afterwards. That's not the way that the market should work. Because now, no one can. Now you're going to be put in a situation where you might end up over-regulating because we didn't go in and try and figure out how to set up a system that works for consumers and works for the
I want to
companies.
let other folks get a chance to read it. So yes, sir, and then go here.
Hi, my name is Andrew Feinberg. I'm with Broadband Census News. I have a question for Mr. Chester. At the beginning of the panel, you spoke about targeting 2.0 and this vast system being assembled to harness information from offline databases and use neuroscience to control us. And I'm wondering, do you have any concrete examples?
Yeah, I mean, first place, go to the filing.
I'm looking at
Go to
the filing
Neurofocus. Go to neurofocus.com or just do a Google search. I'm sorry, I was doing Bing search because I think Frank is in the audience from Microsoft. Do a search for Neurofocus and comma Google, and you will see in our filing that we just submitted to the Federal Trade Commission along with U.S. PERB. What we tried to do is to bring our job is to really bring the Commission up to date. The Commission has been hampered politically and intellectually over the last 10, 15 years. And now there's a new regime. Chairman Leibowitz wants to look at this area, certainly, and has appointed a terrific Director of Consumer Protection, David Vladeck, who has already initiated an inquiry into this area. And we have been providing them. So all that information that I just talked about is in the filing with citations. But if you go to Neurofocus, which Microsoft is using, and others, you will see an example of how online advertising is also using this. So anyway, it's all there.
How would you write a law to make that illegal?
I don't want to go back and forth on that. Any comments here on
This is the classic scare tactic, right? Advertisers don't want to control you. They don't want to change who you are. They want to show you an ad that's relevant because they want you to click on it. They want you to know about their brand. And online advertisers want to target ads so that they actually have some relevance to you, so that you might actually look at them and click on them. So when we're talking about online advertising, when we're talking about the deltas here, that's what it's about. It's about whether the ad is interesting and relevant. It's not about manipulation, control, or deception. These are very different conversations from the privacy conversation.
I just have to add, though, we have asked the Federal Trade Commission, and our colleagues in the EU have asked the EU to regulate neuromarketing and the role of neuromarketing in online advertising, particularly in sensitive areas.
Gary, and then here.
Thank you. Maybe this is one of your other 14 unanswered questions.
Gary, identify yourself.
I'm Gary Arlen from Arlen Communications, and the question is about branded entertainment. And in particular, I think back to the Clinton administration where I had talked either to you or Howard's predecessors at the time about product placement and how integrating a commercial basically into a editorial content was a very interesting and obstructive issue because of keeping First Amendment separate from advertising claims. As branded entertainment becomes a greater part of the web video experience, how do you see this? What's going to materialize and what kind of steps may be taken to protect people who are looking at ads, not knowing they're looking at video entertainment, not knowing it's commercially based, or the material gained from their experience online is going to be used in some other way?
Well, I don't. I think where harm comes from in those contexts is from somebody making a claim in a way that you give it more credence than you would otherwise because of what you think of as the source. And the thing about product placements and branded content is it's not clear to me there's any claim being made about other than this product exists. So I'm not sure why it's a problem. The content the content has always been related to the advertising. I mean, we call them soap operas because it was soap manufacturers who wanted to reach that audience. So that there's always been that connection, and that's neither surprising nor troubling. And I don't see something new or different about it in the online world that would make it trouble.
Of course, it's personal. It's personalized. It's targeted to the individual. It's gathering a tremendous amount of data. It's not clear whether or not it's an advertiser or it's a real independent editorial product. This issue, as we all know, or you and I know, this issue will increasingly be something that governments around the world will have in front. The complete integration online of advertising and editorial content, where advertisers, in fact, are shaping the editorial content.
20 seconds.
Just to briefly tie this in, the connection between that and online advertising is the reason product placement is becoming more important is because of commercial skipping, right? So when you understand that, you start to understand that the consumers have radical capability across media. DVRs for television and online, they have tools like AdBlock that allow them to block ads altogether, to block tracking tools, right? This is the problem facing advertising. And it's not unreasonable to expect that publishers are going to try to improve the profitability of ads that are increasingly easy to skip.
Well, just point that advertisers control more and more of the content. Is that?
Actually, I want to move on.
It's a fantasy.
We can do that one offline because I want to have a conversation.
Yes, I'm Mireille Hildebrand from the Center of Law, Science, Technology and Society Studies at Vrije Universiteit Brussels. Very happy to be here. I've been leading the project on profiling technologies in a European-funded project for the past 5 years. And I'm taking sort of a different perspective. What I see in advertising, in concepts like behavioral servicing, ambient intelligence, Internet of Things, is a kind of proactive computing, trying to guess, calculate the preferences of consumers, and building a system on that. It's not just this. You could say this is only the beginning, but I'm not going to tell a horror story. I think what is very important is the data science that is behind this. We had too much data to an extent that all the data becomes noise. So we need, from whatever perspective, these technologies that infer patterns. This is pattern recognition. This is inferring patterns that we cannot see with the naked human eye. And if we do not use these technologies, the whole system will come down. Now, my problem from the consumer
You make it a question.
yes, I am going to, but I do need the introduction. From the consumer perspective, what is very important is that you are being targeted not on the basis of your own data, but on the basis of group profiles that you match. This is what it is about. So focusing all the attention on my data, trying to either hide them or not hide them, opt in, opt out, to me is not what the discussion should be about. What is very important is to give consumers the possibility, technically, to know what type of profiles they will match depending on which data they leak, because most of the data you are leaking. And these technologies and legal tools. We call them transparency enhancing tools, next TEDs, next to PETs.
Okay, why don't we, any comments on?
Amen. And what you're talking about is being implemented in the real world by companies like Yahoo and Google. They have done a great job with their preference managers. It's just the beginning, but it allows consumers to see, and Blue Kai is another one, allows consumers to see what interests are associated with their profile. And that's exactly the kind of transparency I think we need more of, so I agree with you.
Just
let me answer.
one small answer to that. The problem with that is the same as with P3P, that you are looking at what a company says it is doing.
Let me,
And you're never sure
but fortunately, we have a federal agency already that has the authority to go after unfair and deceptive trade practices.
let me respond, Professor. Because
Let's let these folks talk, because there are other folks who have questions.
I work with Bayou, and I was the one who got Bayou involved in the behavioral, Bayou, yes, in the behavioral targeting space, and there's a reason they held a conference there a few weeks ago, which is the principal European Union consumer group. It has now moved on. It's no longer just based on the aggregation of outside profiles. It now includes systems that have now been deployed in Europe, and we've given the EU to get that information, real-time information about individual unique consumers, and that's being amalgamated into the system. We think, as the EU Privacy Directive and other documents, EU documents require, that people have to have rights around that.
Just two comments. I think I agree with you that individuals need control over, and I think we need to figure out a way to do it that is that works in both directions. What is being collected and what is being used. I think it's difficult to figure out. I think that there also needs to be some kind of auditing to make sure that it's happening. And if you can do that through technological means, which I think you can. There's a company called Better Advertising Project that's coming up with one example way of doing that. I'm sure there are other companies out there that I don't know about that are building similar tools in the same space. So I think it can be done, and I'm optimistic about that, but it's not there yet. I think that that's where we should be headed. I also wanted to point. Aaron mentioned the Turo study before, which I do think it's good for some things. The questions in it, I think, getting some ideas in there. You shouldn't expect it to cover the whole behavioral targeting space, as you can't expect any poll to do that. But one thing that I think that it was really interesting to me in there was this question about targeting advertising based on what you do, targeting content based on what you do, and targeting news based on what you do. Advertising scored badly. I mean, 66% of people, I think, said they did not want their advertising targeted in that way. But 63% of people said they didn't want news targeted to them. Over 50% of people said they didn't want content at all targeted to them, because there's this viewpoint out there that I think we have to grapple with, right, in this space, which is that consumers want the same experience that their neighbor has, no matter who their neighbor is. They don't want that kind of tension. So I think that's
since Jeff has mentioned his website about 12 times, I'll just mention one of my papers, which is sitting outside, about that particular study. And my central point is simply to say that when you do surveys like that and you ask people about targeting and being followed online and tracked, it is an inherently biased study. It does not tell you about real-world choices. So please read that paper and you'll see.
And read the actual study, which is University of Pennsylvania. Let me finish. Because you shouldn't disparage. University of Pennsylvania, UC Berkeley, two highly regarded institutions, and I think they did the best independent analysis, not funded by industry.
My criticism is not of the professors. My point is that the methodology of polls doesn't tell you about real-world choices. It tells you about something different, which is that people feel uncomfortable about the words that are used. And the irony here, of course, is that most of the people on this panel would agree that the old world of mass media and centralization was a bad thing, that personalization is a good thing. And here we are decrying personalization and saying that, oh my God, it's scary, and everybody wants exactly the same thing as their neighbors. Well, we could have that world. It was AT&T when you had a black phone that you rented from the company, and you had very limited choices. On the internet, people want more choices.
I just want you to take out what I said, taken out of context. I am completely a believer in personalization, but personalization means that the individual is involved in making the choices, not that some company is making the choices for them. I think there are ways to do that, and that we have to grapple with that viewpoint there about putting the individual in control of how to make that in all spaces, not just that.
I'm going to let Howard have the last word in less than 30 seconds.
Well, I'm not quite sure I can do
45.
that. Too small.
One is on the Thoreau study. One of the other interesting things people said they didn't want was targeted discounts. And a majority said they didn't want targeted discounts. I think it's 86% of people who have a retail loyalty card that gives them targeted discounts. Behavior and what they say in the survey do not match, and they do not match in a very fundamental way. People aren't making the choices they say they would make in the survey. Second, on this point about algorithms and the information that's being used, I think that's actually an interesting way to think about the problem, because it points to a lot of the same things happen with search advertising. Because if I'm Google, what search ad I get paid per click. So what search ad I'm going to serve depends on what people bid for the keyword. It certainly depends in part on that. But it also depends on the probability that somebody's going to click. And that's worth some analysis and some modeling and trying to predict the probability that you're going to click and serve you the 6 ads with the highest click-through probabilities for you based on whatever information I have that's available about you. And that's, it's the same kind of stuff. That happens with display advertising that's targeted behaviorally. Well, the search advertising has a behavioral component too.
Great. With that, two things to say. One is it's very difficult to be a moderator, I have to tell you. Gosh, I wanted to jump in so many times, but I think I ably resisted that urge. Secondly, I want to really commend our 4 debaters. I think they did a great job. They were focused, to the point, and I thought provided a lot of insights. And finally, Peter, who I thought was a good sport to sit here and listen to that, didn't have to stop any chair throwing or anything, which he lined in the middle, and also I appreciate his insights. So please join me in thanking the great panel.